the simulcast is working. Hopefully the simulcast is working. It is working. So I wanted to cover Ozma of Oz, chapter 3, probably chapter 3, 4, and 5. Ozma of Oz has this strange structure. I did a Freitag's triangle over here. If it doesn't turn that around backwards, for whatever reason, I don't know how to just make sure it doesn't turn it around backwards. But it has a weird sort of Freitag's triangle. Baum plots a lot of his books this way, where he'll have a lot of these Freitag's triangles. He'll have a lot of these peaks. But he has a lot of close structured ones where the peaks all really come together. Like the first two, all of the peaks were directly related. Whereas this one kind of has an unusual structure where it has these three different villains, but they kind of sort of have a connection, but not really. So Dorothy meets the Wheelers. That's the next one. Then Princess Langwidere, and then the most of the book, the bulk of the book is about the Gnome King. So she meets the Gnome King at the end. So it's kind of an unusual structure. A little bit obsessed with structure. I could talk to you all day about story structure. I don't know how useful that is, but she meets the Wheelers next. That's the whole plot of the next section. So I'm just gonna read it because that's the part that I haven't quite gotten around to. I'm waiting for my son Callum to pay attention and listen and all that. This is what I need to catch up on. Somebody's doing lawn work outside, so you might hear lawn work outside. This is what people do in a quarantine, I guess. They do a lot of lawn work. Beats me. But anyway, this is for my students partly, but also for, if you just like a great story. Ozma of Oz is a great story. This is the third part of the Oz series by L. Frank Baum. This is chapter 3. What happened in chapter 1 and 2? Dorothy got shipwrecked. She met a talking chicken. That's kind of it. Very sort of a slow, gradual build. There's not a whole lot of exposition. If you can see if you can imagine the Freitag's triangle, it's not a whole lot of exposition because this is the third in the series. So you don't get that a lot in the third in the series. But there is just a lot. It just jumps right into action. She's on a shipwreck. There's this talking chicken. That's kind of the sequence. And then this is chapter 3. Letters in the sand. Beware the Wheelers. Walking a little way back from the water's edge towards the grove of trees. My cat Bo is listening. If you can see her in the shot. She's watching me talk. There you go. I'll move her up a little bit. There you go. She's intently listening to me read. If Callum won't listen to me, Bo will. Dorothy came to a flat stretch of white sand that seemed to have queer signs marked upon its surface, just as one would write upon a sand with a stick. What does it say? She asked the yellow hen, who trotted along beside her in a rather dignified fashion. How should I know? Returned the hen. I cannot read. Oh, can't you? Certainly not. I've never been to school, Well, I have, admitted Dorothy. But the letters are big and far apart, and it's hard to spell out the words. But she looked at each letter carefully and finally discovered that these words were written in sand. Beware the Wheelers. Isn't that scary, Bo? Bo, is that scary? No, okay. That's rather strange, declared the hen, when Dorothy had read aloud the words. What do you suppose the Wheelers are? Folks that wheel, I guess. They must have wheelbarrows or baby cabs or hand carts, said Dorothy. The dogs are coming in. If you hear dog breathing sounds, my dogs have now entered the room. You guys want to hear the chapter 3? They're not gonna talk. This is not Oz, so you can't talk, I guess. That's rather strange, declared the hen. Shush. I didn't say speak. He just barks at me randomly. I don't know. He's got a weird brain. Stop barking at me. Yeah, I'm talking to you. Stop barking at me. There's no reason to bark at me. That's rather strange, declared the hen. When Dorothy had read aloud the words, "What do you suppose the Wheelers are?" Oh, I read that already. Perhaps they're automobiles. There's a significant thing. I probably the next episode I'll talk about that. But the whole idea of automobiles, brand new idea when this book came out. And so a lot of the times the Wheelers are interpreted that way as sort of Baum's riff on automobiles. There's an article by Vivian Wagner, my students sometimes read that, where she talks about a lot of the Oz series as being about technology anxiety. There's a lot of these references to technology, and she interprets that, Vivian Wagner, interprets that a lot of it to be about technology anxiety. So the Wheelers are these really creepy villains. They have wheels for hands. They're inhuman. So, that's sort of a common interpretation there. But it's rooted in the anxiety about the technology. That's the significance of that parallel. Next episode. It can't be automobiles, replied the girl, for this is a new wild country without even trolley cars or telephones. All these technology references constantly. Very new sort of technologies at the time. The people here haven't been discovered yet. I'm sure, that is, if there are any people. So I don't believe there can be any automobiles. Bellina? Perhaps not, admitted the yellow hen. Where are you going now? Over to those trees to see if I can find some fruit or nuts, answered Dorothy. Post-colonialism is one of those interpretive strategies that I've never read about Oz series, but that would be fascinating. This is the Kingdom of Oz invades the Kingdom of Ev, so there's tons you could say there for sure. But I just haven't read an article about that. Anyway, for the scholars out there, want to break new ground on Oz studies, post-colonial Oz studies, have not read an article on that, would be a fantastic topic. She tramped, I'm trying not to get too distracted. She tramped across the sand, skirting the foot of one of the little rocky hills that stood near and soon reached the edge of the forest. At first, she was greatly disappointed because the nearer trees were all punita or cottonwood or eucalyptus and bore no fruit or nuts at all. But by and by, when she was almost in despair, the little girl came upon two trees that promised to furnish her with plenty of food. One was quite full of square paper boxes, which grew in clusters on all the limbs, and upon the biggest and ripest boxes, the word lunch could be read in neat raised letters. There's Bo. In neat raised letters. Just sit down. There you go. Just sit down. It's okay. In neat raised letters, the trees seemed to bear all the year round, for there were lunchbox blossoms on some of the branches, and on other tiny little lunch boxes there were as yet quite green and evidently not fit to eat until they had grown bigger. So here's the organic and the inorganic being mixed together. There's a great thing to notice about the book for sure. Very, very brand new sort of concept in fiction at this time. No cyborgs or robots hadn't even been a word that was invented yet. The leaves of this tree were all paper napkins, and it presented a very pleasing appearance to the hungry little girl. But the tree next to the lunchbox tree was even more wonderful, for it bore quantities of tin dinner pails, which were so full and heavy that the stout branches bent underneath their weight. Some were small and dark brown in color. Those larger were of a dull tin color, but the really ripe ones were pails of bright tin that shone and glistened beautifully in the rays of the sunshine that touched them. Dorothy was delighted, and even the yellow hen acknowledged that she was surprised. The little girl stood on tiptoe and picked one of the nicest, biggest lunch boxes, and then she sat down upon the ground and eagerly opened it. Inside she found nicely wrapped in white papers a ham sandwich, a piece of sponge cake, a pickle, a slice of new cheese, and an apple. Each thing had a separate stem and so had to be picked off the side of the box. But Dorothy found them all to be delicious, and she ate every bit of luncheon in the box before she had finished. A lunch isn't exactly breakfast, she said to Belina, who sat beside her curiously watching. But when one is hungry, one can eat even supper in the morning and not complain. I hope your lunchbox was perfectly ripe, observed the yellow hen in an anxious tone. So much sickness is caused by eating green things. Oh, I'm sure it was ripe, declared Dorothy. All that is, except a pickle, and a pickle just has to be green. Belina. But everything tasted perfectly splendid. And now I think I'll pick a dinner pail to have when I get hungry again. And then we'll start out and explore the country and see where we are. Haven't you any idea what country this is? Inquired Belina. Here's the dinner pail. That's a great John Arneal illustration, for sure. None at all, but listen, I'm quite sure it's a fairy country, or such things as lunchboxes and dinner pails wouldn't be growing up on trees. Besides, Belina being a hen, you wouldn't be able to talk in any civilized country like Kansas, where no fairies live at all. Perhaps we're in a land of Oz. I mean, all these references to civilized countries. Fairy countries are not civilized countries. There's a really fascinating reference there. If you're doing post-colonial interpretation, that would be a huge line to talk about. But anyway, I don't talk about post-colonial interpretation with my students, partly because, as I said, there are no articles about that I've read, at least. There's one by John Funchion that does talk about colonialism, but and so it does come up in that one. I shouldn't say there are no articles. It does come up in that one, in some kind of complicated ways. But lines like that are perfect examples. Like, this is not a civilized country, because animals wouldn't talk in a civilized country. Kansas is civilized. That's partly ironic, because right at the beginning of book one, it's very bleak and lifeless. Anyway, not to get too distracted. Perhaps we're in the land of Oz, said the hen thoughtfully. No, that can't be, answered the little girl, because I've been in the land of Oz, and it's all surrounded by a horrid desert that no one can cross. Then how did you get away from there again? Asked Belina. I had a pair of silver shoes that carried me through the air, like Superman or Superwoman. Very different from the movie. But I lost them, said Dorothy. Ah, indeed, remarked the yellow hen in a tone of unbelief. Anyhow, resumed the girl, there is no seashore near the land of Oz, so this must surely be some other fairy country. While she was speaking, she selected a bright and pretty dinner pail that seemed to have a stout handle and picked it from its branch. Then, accompanied by the yellow hen, she walked out of the shadow of the trees towards the seashore. They were part way across the sands when Belina suddenly cried in a voice of terror. This would be an entertaining voice. I'm not going to do it, though. What's that? A little bit of a voice of terror. Dorothy turned quickly around and saw coming out of the path that led from between the trees the most peculiar person her eyes had ever beheld. It had the form of a man, except that it walked, or rather rolled, upon all fours, and its legs were the same lengths of its arms, giving them the appearance of 4 legs of a beast. Yet it was no beast that Dorothy had discovered, for the person was clothed most gorgeously in embroidered garments of many colors, and wore a straw hat perched jauntily upon the side of its head. But it differed from human beings in this respect, that instead of hands and feet, there grew at the end of its arms and legs round wheels, and by means of these wheels it rolled very swiftly over the level ground. Afterward, Dorothy found that these odd wheels were of the same hard substance that her fingernails and toenails are composed of. She also learned that creatures of this strange race were born of this queer fashion. But when our little girl first caught sight of the first individual of a race that was destined to cause her a lot of trouble, she had an idea that the brilliantly clothed personage was on roller skates, which were attached to his hands as well as his feet. Run, screamed the yellow hen, fluttering away in great fright. It's a wheeler. A wheeler, exclaimed Dorothy. What can that be? Don't you remember the warning in the sand? Beware the wheelers. Run, I tell you, run. So Dorothy ran, and the Wheeler gave a sharp, wild cry and came after her in full chase. Looking over her shoulder as she ran, the girl now saw a great procession of Wheelers emerging from the forest, dozens and dozens of them, all clad in splendid, tight-fitting garments, and all rolling swiftly toward her and uttering their wild, strange cries. "They're sure to catch us," panted the girl, who was still carrying the heavy dinner pail she had picked. "I can't run much farther, Billina. Climb up this hill, quick," said the hen, and Dorothy found she was very near to the heap of loose and jagged rocks they had passed on their way to the forest. The yellow hen was even now fluttering among the rocks, and Dorothy followed as best she could, half climbing and half tumbling up the rough and rugged steep. She was none too soon, for the foremost Wheeler reached the hill a moment after her. But while the girl scrambled up the rocks, the creature stopped short with howls of rage and disappointment. Dorothy now heard the yellow hen laughing in her cackling henny way. "Don't hurry, my dear," cried Billina. "They can't follow us among these rocks, so we're safe enough now." Dorothy stopped at once and sat down upon the broad boulder, for she was all out of breath. The rest of the Wheelers had now reached the foot of the hill, and it was evident that their wheels would not roll upon the rough and jagged rocks, and therefore they were helpless to follow Dorothy and the hen to where they had taken refuge. But they circled all around the little hill, so the child and Billina were fast prisoners, could not come down without being captured. Then the creatures shook their front wheels at Dorothy in a threatening manner, and it seemed they were able to speak as well as to make their dreadful outcries, for several of them shouted, "We'll get you in time, never fear. And when we do get you, we'll tear you into little bits." "Why are you so cruel to me?" asked Dorothy. "I'm a stranger in your country, and I've done you no harm," Dorothy taking for granted that people are nice. "No harm," cried one who seemed to be their leader. "Did you not pick our lunch boxes and dinner pails? Have you not stolen a dinner pail still in your hand?" "I only picked one of each," she answered. "I was hungry. I didn't know the trees were yours." "That is no excuse," retorted the leader, who was clothed in a most gorgeous suit. "It is the law here that whoever picks a dinner pail without our permission must die immediately." "Don't you believe him?" said Billina. "I'm sure the trees do not belong to these awful creatures. They are fit for any mischief, and it's my opinion they would try to kill us just the same if you hadn't picked a dinner pail." "I think so too," agreed Dorothy. "But what shall we do now?" Stay where we are. That's a bit of a tongue twister," advised the yellow hen. "We are safe from the Wheelers until we starve to death, anyhow. And before that time comes, a good many things can happen." There's a dramatic ending to a chapter. But Billina is definitely an interesting character in the Oz series, because very few characters will get a one-up on Dorothy, really. Dorothy tends to be the cleverest, but certainly in book one you'll have moments where the Scarecrow is more clever, or moments where the Tin Man rescues people. But as a whole, they tend to be more clever. But arguably, Billina ends up being the most, spoiler alert, I guess. She ends up being the most useful of all the characters. If you look at the Fried Dogs Triangle, I'll just glance at this one more time. Arguably, the real plot happens really in the second half of the book. And Dorothy kind of doesn't do much in the second half of the book. So that's kind of the tricky thing about Hero's Journey with this one, or identifying the hero or the main character or whatever with this one. It is much more of an ensemble sort of story. But arguably, Billina ends up being one of the most useful characters. But Baum loved chickens. There's a weird bit of trivia about Frank Baum. He loved chickens. He had a lot of these random publications. Like he had published I forget exactly what it's called, but he published like a magazine or about fancy chickens. Random trivia. He loved chickens. He published a book about store decorations, store window decorations. He has a lot of these kind of random things. Very interesting character. Next episode is biographical stuff. Next chapter. TikTok, the Machine Man. After an hour or so of most of the band of wheelers. I'm reading that really badly. Hold on. After an hour or so, most of the band of wheelers rolled back into the forest. That makes a lot more sense. Leaving only 3 of their number to guard the hill. These curled themselves up like big dogs and pretended to go to sleep on the sands. But neither Dorothy nor Bellina were fooled by this trick, so they remained in security among the rocks and paid no attention to their cunning enemies. Finally, the hen, fluttering over the mound, exclaimed, "Why, here's a path." So Dorothy at once clambered to where Bellina sat. There, sure enough, was a smooth path cut between the rocks. It seemed to wind around the mound from top to bottom like a corkscrew, twisting here and there between the rough boulders, but always remaining level and easy to walk upon. Indeed, Dorothy wondered at first why the wheelers did not roll up this path, but when she followed it to the foot of the mound, she found that several big pieces of rock had been placed directly across the end of the way, thus preventing anyone outside from seeing it, and also preventing the wheelers from using it to climb up the mound. Then Dorothy walked up the path and followed it until she came to the very top of the hill, where a solitary round rock stood that was bigger than any of the others surrounding it. The path came to an end just beside this great rock, and for a moment it puzzled the girl to know why the path had been made at all. But the hen, who had been gravely following her around and was now perched upon a point of rock behind Dorothy, suddenly remarked, "It looks something like a door, doesn't it?" "What looks like a door?" inquired the child. "Why, that crack in the rock just facing you," replied Bellina, whose little round eyes were very sharp and seemed to see everything. "It runs up one side and down the other, across the top and the bottom." "What does?" "Why, the crack. So I think it must be a door of rock, although I do not see any hinges." "Oh, yes," said Dorothy, now observing for the first time the crack in the rock. "And isn't this a keyhole, Bellina?" Pointing to the round, deep hole at one side of the door. "Of course, we only had the key. If we only had the key, now we could unlock it and see what is there," replied the yellow hen. "Maybe it's a treasure chamber full of diamonds and rubies or heaps of shining gold. Or, that reminds me," said Dorothy, "of the golden key I picked up on the shore. Do you think that it would fit the keyhole, Bellina?" "Try it and see," suggested the hen. So Dorothy searched in the pocket of her dress and found the golden key, and when she had put it into the hole of the rock and turned it, a sudden sharp snap was heard. Then, with a solemn creak that made the shivers run down the child's back, the face of the rock fell outward like a door on hinges and revealed a small dark chamber just inside. "Good gracious!" cried Dorothy, shrinking back as far as the narrow path would let her. For standing within the narrow chamber of the rock was the form of a man, or at least it seemed like a man in the dim light. He was only as tall as Dorothy herself, and his body was round as a ball and made out of burnished copper. Also his head and limbs were copper, and these were jointed or hinged to his body in a peculiar way, with metal caps over the joints, like the armor worn by... No. Stop. I'm trying to read this book. You hush your face. The armor worn by knights of days of old. He stood perfectly still, and where the light struck upon his form, it glittered as if made of pure gold. Don't be frightened, called Belina from her perch. It isn't alive. Are you frightened, Ziku? Are you frightened? I see it isn't, replied the girl, drawing a long breath. It is made out of copper, like the old kettle in a barnyard at home, continued the hen, turning her head first to one side and then the other. Here's TikTok. I think I've talked about it before on previous episodes. So that both her little round eyes could examine the object. Once, said Dorothy, I knew a man made out of tin who was a woodman named Nick Chopper. That's the Tin Woodman, of course. I forget when he gets his name. I think he gets his name in book 2. I don't think he's named it book 1. I can't remember. But Nick Chopper is actually usually what Baum calls him for the rest of the series. And he doesn't call him the Tin Woodman. He calls him Nick Chopper. But he was he has a book called The Tin Woodman. In that one, they talk about him being the Tin Woodman a lot because there's another 10 character in that book. But anyway, that's trivia. But he was as alive as we are because he was born a real man and got his tin body a little at a time. And I talked about that in a previous episode, how TikTok is kind of the opposite of the Tin Man in many ways. First a leg, and then a finger, and then an ear, for the reason that he had so many accidents with his axe and cut himself up in a very careless manner. Oh, said the hen with a sniff, as if she did not believe the story. But this copper man, continued Dorothy, looking at with big eyes, is not alive at all, and I wonder what it was made for, and why it was locked up in this queer place. That is a mystery, remarked the hen, twisting her head to arrange her wing feathers with her bill. Dorothy stepped inside the little room to get a back view of the copper man, and in this way discovered a printed card that hung between his shoulders, it being suspended from a small copper peg at the back of his neck. She unfastened this card and returned to the path where the light was better and sat herself down upon the slab of rock to read the printing. What does it say? Asked the hen curiously. Dorothy read the card aloud, spelling out the big words with some difficulty, and this is what she read. Smith & Tinker's patent double action, extra responsive, thought creating, perfect talking mechanical man, fitted with our special clockwork attachment, thinks, speaks, acts, and does everything but live. Manufactured only at our works at... The print is really small. It has this little card. Has this little card in there, but the print is very, very small. So hold on. I can't really read the tiny print. I'm getting old. How queer, said the yellow hen. Do you think that is all true, my dear? I don't know, answered Dorothy, who had more to read. Listen to this, Belina. Directions for using, for thinking, wind the clockwork man under his left arm. For speaking, wind the clockwork man under his right arm. For walking in action, wind the clockwork man in the middle of his back. Well, I declare, gasped the yellow hen in amazement, if the copper man can do half of these things, he is a very wonderful machine. But I suppose it is all humbug, like so many other patented articles. So that's a loaded statement there. The wizard in book 1 is called a humbug, so there's a connection right there. He's a humbug because he uses technology to pretend to be magic. So that's, there are a lot of these references to Baum's technology anxiety. And that word humbug is a bit of a clue to that. So he was fascinated by technology, but also had anxiety about technology. He has that sort of paradoxical response to it. Where is the key to the clockwork? Asked Belina. Hanging on. Hush. Why are you so noisy when I'm trying to talk? Hush. Hush. Me saying hush doesn't mean you can just bark again. I can wait. I'm trying to get this done. Are you done? Okay. Whatever you want. He just does this all the time. Just sits there and barks at me. Then said the hen, let us try him and find out if he will go. He is warranted for 1,000 years, it seems, but we do not know how long he has been standing inside this rock. Dorothy had already taken the clock key from the peg. Which shall I wind up first? She asked, looking again at the directions on the card. Number 1, I should think, returned Bellina. That makes him think, doesn't it? Yes, said Dorothy, and wound up number 1 and under the left arm. He doesn't seem any different, remarked the hen critically. Why, of course not. He is only thinking now, said Dorothy. I wonder what he is thinking about. I'll wind up his talk, and then perhaps he can tell us, said the girl. So she wound up number 2, and immediately the Clockwork Man said, without moving any part of his body except his lips, Good morning, little girl. Good morning, Mrs. Hen. The words sounded like a little hoarse and creaky. They were uttered all in the same tone, without any change of expression whatever. But both Dorothy and Bellina understood them perfectly. Good morning, sir. There's a classic TikTok image. This is the TikTok image you always see. Dorothy and Bellina understood them perfectly. Good morning, sir. They answered politely. Thank you for rescuing me, continued the machine in the same monotone voice, which seemed to be worked by bellows inside of him, like the little toy lambs and cats the children squeeze so that they will make a noise. Don't mention it, answered Dorothy. And then, being very curious, she asked, How did you come to be locked in this place? It is a long story, replied the Copper Man, but I will tell it to you briefly. I was purchased from Smith and Tinker, my manufacturers, by the cruel King of Ev, named Evoldo, who used to beat all of his servants until they died. However, he was not able to kill me because I was not alive, and one must first live in order to die, so that all his beating did me no harm and merely kept my copper body well polished. King Evoldo's another villain. There's so many villains in this whole thing. Evoldo's dead before the story, but he's still just an awful, awful character. This cruel king had a lovely wife and 10 beautiful children, 5 boys and 5 girls, but in a fit of anger, he sold them all to the Gnome King, who by means of his magic arts changed them all into other forms and put them in his underground palace to ornament the rooms, turned them into these ornaments, these little toys and things like that. Which is the objectification. That's just something that constantly comes up in this book, is characters who are objectified in various ways. Afterward, the King of Ev regretted his wicked action and tried to get his wife and children away from the Gnome King, but without avail. So in despair, he locked me up in this rock, threw the key into the ocean, and then jumped in after it and was drowned. How very dreadful. It is pretty dreadful, exclaimed Dorothy. It is indeed, said the machine. When I found myself imprisoned, I shouted for help until my voice ran down, and then I walked back and forth in this little room till my action ran down, and then I stood still and thought until my thoughts ran down. After that, I remembered nothing until you wound me up again. It's a very wonderful story, said Dorothy, and proves that the land of Ev is really a fairy land, as I thought it was. Of course it is, answered the Copper Man. I do not suppose such a perfect machine as I am could be made in any place but a fairyland. I've never seen one in Kansas, said Dorothy. But where did you get the key to unlock this door? Asked the clockwork voice. I found it on the shore, where it was probably washed up by the waves, she answered. And now, sir, if you don't mind, I'll wind up your action. That will please me very much, said the machine. So she wound up number 3, and at once the Copper Man, in a somewhat stiff and jerky fashion, walked out of the rocky cavern, took off his copper hat, and bowed politely, then kneeled before Dorothy. Said he, From this time forth, I am your obedient servant. Whatever you command, that I will do willingly, if you keep me wound up. So very willingly, he's giving himself over as Dorothy's servant. So very different sort of perspective on objectification, for sure. Tick-tock, he replied. My former master gave me that name because my clockwork always ticks when it is wound up. I can hear it now, said the yellow hen. So can I, said Dorothy. And then he added with some anxiety. Interesting that a robot has anxiety. Oh, Buffy. I got started with this just because I had to catch up. I was running behind. So Tick-tock, we just found Tick-tock, the robot. He's explaining his background. Tick-tock, he replied. My former master gave me that name because my clockwork always ticks when it is wound up. I can hear it now, said the yellow hen. So can I, said Dorothy. And then she added with some anxiety, You don't strike, do you? No, answered Tick-tock, and there is no alarm connected with my machinery. I can tell the time, though, by speaking, and as I never sleep, I can waken you at any hour you wish to get up in the morning. Here's Tick-tock again. There's a bunch of these types of pictures where it's just Tick-tock hanging out with Dorothy and Billina. That's nice, said the little girl, only I never wish to get up in the morning. You can sleep until I lay my eggs, said the yellow hen. Then when I cackle, Tick-tock will know it is time to waken you. Do you lay your eggs very early? Asked Dorothy. About 8 o'clock, said Billina, and everybody ought to be up by that time, I'm sure. That is the end of the chapter. Now, the next chapter, Dorothy opens the dinner pail. Dorothy opens the dinner pail. The light is not really making it easy to look at. There you go. Dorothy opens the dinner pail. There you go. There's Dorothy on the top of the rocks. You hush. I am talking. Dorothy on top of the rocks. There's Tick-tock and Billina. Dorothy opens the dinner pail. Now, Tick-tock, said Dorothy. The first thing to be done is to find a way for us to escape from these rocks. The Wheelers are down below, you know, and threaten to kill us. There is no reason to be afraid of the Wheelers. If you're just joining us, the Wheelers are just monsters with wheels for hands and feet. They're very creepy and terrifying. They have Dorothy trapped on top of the rocks. That's all, really. It's just nothing much beyond that. And then they found Tick-tock, wound him up. That's where we are in the plot. There's no reason to be afraid of the Wheelers, said Tick-tock, the words coming more slowly than before. Why not, she asked. Because they are... he's stuttering. A-G-G-G-R-G-R. Okay, sit down. There you go. He gave a sort of gurgle and stopped short, waving his hands frantically until suddenly he became motionless with one arm in the air and the other held stiffly before him with all the copper fingers of the hand spread out like a fan. Dear me, said Dorothy in a frightened tone. What can the matter be? He's run down, I suppose, said the hen calmly. You couldn't have wound him up very tight. I didn't know how much to wind him, replied the girl, but I'll try to do better next time. She ran around the copper man to take the key from the peg at the back of his neck, but it was not there. It's gone, cried Dorothy in dismay. What's gone? Asked Billina. The key. It probably fell off when he made that low bow to you, returned the hen. Look around and see if you cannot find it again. Dorothy looked, and the hen helped her, and by the girl discovered the clock key, which had fallen into the crack of the rock. At once she wound up Tick-tock's voice, taking care to give the key as many turns as it would go around. She found this quite a task, as you may imagine, if you have ever tried to wind a clock. And the machine man's first words were to assure Dorothy. There's some tongue twisters in here. That he would now run for at least 24 hours. You did not wind me much at first, he calmly said, and I told you that long story about King Evoldo, so it is no wonder that I ran down. She next rewound the action clockwork, and then Belina advised her to carry the key to Tick-Tock in her pocket, so it would not get lost again. "And now," said Dorothy, when all this was accomplished, "tell me what you were going to say about the Wheelers." And Belina is really the only one of the few characters who successfully bosses Dorothy around. Interestingly, probably because Baum loved chicken so much. I don't know. "And now," said Dorothy, "when all this is accomplished, tell me what you were going to say about the Wheelers." "Why, they are nothing to be frightened at," said the machine. "They are to make folks believe that they are very terrible. But as a matter of fact, the Wheelers are harmless enough to anyone that dares to fight them. They might try to hurt a little girl like you, perhaps, because they are very mischievous. But if I had a club, they would run away as soon as they saw me." "Haven't you a club?" asked Dorothy. "No," said Tick-Tock. "And you won't find such a thing among these rocks either," declared the yellow hen. Oh, here's another. Just Dorothy and Tick-Tock hanging out. There's a lot of pictures, just kind of Dorothy and Tick-Tock hanging out. That's it. Not much to it. They're just sitting below a tree. John O'Neill just kind of draws the same thing in different versions of the same thing. So Dorothy rewound this thought machinery. Wind up my think words. Think works tightly, and I will try to think of some other plans, said Tick-Tock. So Dorothy rewound his thought machinery, and while he was thinking, she decided to eat her dinner. Belina was already pecking away at the cracks in the rocks to find something to eat, so Dorothy sat down and opened her tin dinner pail. In the cover, she found a small tank that was full of very nice lemonade. It was covered by a cup, which might also, when removed, be used to drink the lemonade from. In case you're just joining us, they found a tree full of dinner pails. That's a big part of the plot, I guess, for this small part. Singularly enough, the nuts in this dinner pail grew already cracked, so that Dorothy had no trouble in picking out their meat to eat. She spread the feast upon the rock beside her and began her dinner, first offering some of it to Tick-Tock, who declined because, as he said, he was merely a machine. Afterwards, she offered to share with Belina, but the hen murmured something about dead things and said she preferred her bugs and ants. "Do the lunchbox trees and dinner pail trees belong to the Wheelers?" the child asked Tick-Tock while engaged in eating her meal. "Of course not," he answered. "They belong to the royal family of Ev. Only, of course, there is no royal family just now, because King Evoldo jumped into the sea, and his wife and 10 children have been transformed by the Gnome King." That's the big part of the plot right there. Coming up later, that's the driving part of the plot. Perhaps it is for this reason that the Wheelers claimed the trees for their own and picked the luncheons and dinners to eat themselves. But they belong to the king, and you will find the royal E stamped upon the bottom of every dinner pail. Dorothy turned the pail over and at once discovered the royal mark upon it, and as Tick-Tock had said. "Are the Wheelers the only folks living in the land of Ev?" inquired the girl. "No, they only inhabit a small portion of it, just back of the woods," replied the machine. "But they have always been mischievous and impertinent. My old master, King Evoldo, used to carry a whip with him when he walked out." King Evoldo is kind of terrible in every way. When he walked out to keep the creatures in order. "When I was first made, the Wheelers tried to run over me and butt me with their heads, but they soon found I was built of too solid material for them to injure." "You seem very durable," said Dorothy. Who made you?" This is one of my favorite parts of the whole book. Kind of a throwaway part, but still one of my favorite parts. "The firm of Smith and Tinker in the town of Evna, where the royal palace stands," answered Tick-Tock. "Did they make many of you?" asked the child. "No, I am the only automatic mechanical man. Excuse me. I'm the only automatic mechanical man they ever completed," he replied. "They were very wonderful inventors, were my makers, and quite artistic in all they did." "I am sure of that," said Dorothy. "Do they live in the town of Evna now?" They are both gone, replied the machine. Mr. Smith was an artist as well as an inventor, and he painted a picture of a river which was so natural that, as he was reaching across it to paint some flowers on the opposite bank, he fell into the water and was drowned. Oh, I'm sorry for that, exclaimed the little girl. Mr. Tinker, continued Tick-Tock, made a ladder so tall that he could rest the end of it against the moon while he stood on the highest rung and picked the little stars to set in the points of the king's crown. But when he got to the moon, Mr. Tinker found it such a lovely place that he decided to live there. So he pulled up the ladder after him, and we have never seen him since. That's one of my favorite parts of the whole book. That was a lot of trends that's tying into at the time. The technological utopia trend is something that Baum is riffing on, but also traveling to the moon. There was a lot of stuff about traveling to the moon at the turn of the century. But anyway, one of my favorite parts of the whole book. He must have been a great loss to this country, said Dorothy, who was by this time eating her custard pie. Custard pie. He was, acknowledged Tick-Tock. Also, he is a great loss to me, for if I should get out of order, I do not know of anyone able to repair me, because I am so complicated. You have no idea how full of machinery I am. I can imagine it, said Dorothy readily. And now, continued the machine, I must stop talking and begin thinking again of a way to escape from this rock. So he turned halfway around in order to think without being disturbed. The best thinker I ever knew, said Dorothy to the yellow hen, was a scarecrow. Of course, referencing book one. Nonsense, snapped Billina. It is true, declared Dorothy. I met him in the land of Oz, and he traveled with me to the city of the great Wizard of Oz, so as to get some brains, for his head was only stuffed with straw. But it seemed to me that he thought just as well before he got his brains as he did afterward. Big part of book one there. I have a lot of students who will still say the wizard gave the scarecrow his brains. You could say anything you want about a piece of literature, but I would certainly argue with that particular point. I don't think the wizard gave him brains. That's kind of arguably missing the point. But anyway, that's a side note. Did you expect me to believe all that rubbish about the land of Oz? Inquired Billina, who seemed a little cross, perhaps because bugs were scarce. What rubbish? Asked the child, who was now finishing her nuts and raisins. Why, your impossible stories about animals that can talk, and Tin Woodman who is alive, and a scarecrow who can think. They are all there, said Dorothy, for I have seen them. I don't believe it, cried the hen, with a toss of her head. That's because you're so ignorant. Dorothy will get sassy like that with characters every once in a while. Replied the girl, who was a little offended at her friend Billina's speech. In the land of Oz, remarked Tick-Tock, turning toward them, anything is possible, for it is a wonderful fairy country. There, Billina, what did I say? Cried Dorothy. And then she turned to the machine and asked in an eager tone, Do you know the land of Oz, Tick-Tock? No, but I have heard about it, said the copper man, for it is only separated from this land of Ev by a broad desert. Dorothy clapped her hands together delightedly. Oh, this is my favorite. Probably my favorite. I don't know. One of my favorite John O'Neill illustrations. This is Mr. Tinker going to the moon. It's just a real brief part of the whole book, but it's just, I think it's beautiful. And in color, it's a lot prettier in color actually, but it's a beautiful illustration of just this random throwaway reference in the book. But I love it. It's my favorite. The scarecrow I told you of, Billina, is the king of the land of Oz. Dorothy doesn't realize he's not the king anymore. Pardon me, he's not the king now, said Tick-Tock. He was when I left there, declared Dorothy. I know, said Tick-Tock, but there was a revolution in the land of Oz, and the scarecrow was deposed by a soldier woman named General Ginger. And then Ginger was deposed by a little girl named Ozma. The title of the book. And one of the main characters. coming up soon. As I said, I mean, the second half is kind of the main plot of the book. That's when Ozma comes in. Who is the rightful heir of the throne and now rules the land under the title Ozma of Oz. That is news to me, said Dorothy thoughtfully, but I suppose lots of things have happened since I left the land of Oz. I wonder what has become of the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman and the Cowardly Lion, and I wonder who this girl Ozma is, for I never heard of her before. But Tick-Tock did not reply to this. He had turned around again to resume his thinking. Dorothy packed the rest of the food back into the pail so as not to be wasteful of good things. Good idea, Dorothy. Appreciate that. And the yellow hen forgot her dignity far enough to pick up all of the scattered crumbs, which she ate rather greedily, although she had so lately pretended to despise the things that Dorothy preferred as food. By this time, Tick-Tock approached them with a stiff bow. Be kind enough to follow me, he said, and I will lead you away from here to the town of Evna, where you will be more comfortable, and also I will protect you from the Wheelers. All right, answered Dorothy promptly. I'm ready. So there we go. There's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is the Heads of Langwidere. The Heads of Langwidere. I will save that one for when Callum's here because I know he'll appreciate the craziness of that chapter. It's about a character who steals people's heads, which is wild. But anyway, so if you see, I mean, just to wrap it up on that section, that's the Tick-Tock section and the Wheeler section. Really, that whole section, a lot of it tends to be interpreted as manifestation of Baum's anxieties about technology. Technology was advancing to a pretty extreme degree in the turn of the century. The introduction of all kinds of technologies around that time. So you had plenty of people highlighting it as this utopia, but plenty of people highlighting the advances in technology as being the end of humanity. You still got that sort of thing all the time now. Clearly, we're not nearly as anxious about anxiety as they were back then, but technology is much more pervasive than today than it was at the turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century. But so Baum is sort of embodying both of those perspectives simultaneously. This is what Baum does. He'll embody two seemingly contradictory things simultaneously. He does this constantly. What position does he take? Is he pro-technology? Is he anti-technology? With Baum, the answer is yes, all of the above. That's the tricky thing about interpreting Baum. But anyway, we'll continue later with the next chapter, The Heads of Langwidere. But I'm going to do an episode talking about history. There you go. Next episode will be about some of the history of Baum. So it's connected to a lot of the stuff that I was just talking about. But I will end it for right now on that particular topic. Thank you for joining us. See you on the next episode, which I will catch up on and do very soon. Maybe immediately. That might be an idea. Okay, hold on. Let me end this one. Ending video. There you go.